Okay, students, so we're going to move on to section 3. And this is where political parties actually start to form. And we've been talking about that for a while in class about how this happened in really early on, right after Washington was president, almost at the end of his presidency. Okay, so people loved and adored Washington, and they probably would have voted him for another term of office. And there were no term limits back in those days. He did have some critics, though. Most of these critics were supporters of Thomas Jefferson, and they knew that Washington had backed Hamilton as far as the National Bank was concerned, and they didn't like that. And they also knew that Jefferson did not back Hamilton as far as the bank was concerned. Because remember, like I told you last time, Jefferson said, there's no bank. Bank is not mentioned in the Constitution. You can't just invent a bank. And Hamilton goes, oh, yes, I can. The Elastic Clause says that we can do this, the Congress can do this. And so some people are really against that whole idea. And so they tend to back Jefferson, and Washington is taking Hamilton's side on this. Okay, so even though Washington suggests there should not be political parties, this is, as I said at the end of the last screencast, this is good advice if you can follow it, but it's nearly impossible to follow. It's only natural that people who think the same way about how a country should be run, we're going to tend to band together. And even though Washington, he proposes that he stands above politics, and historians will speak as though he stands above politics, he obviously doesn't. He took sides with Hamilton. He didn't really stay neutral, and that's okay. I mean, he believed he needed a strong central government, and that's what Hamilton stood for. And okay, so you're a Federalist. Okay, fine and good. Then you're a Federalist. And he needed a strong central government, and so he believed in that. Okay, good. Okay, so the first political parties, they're called Federalists, and that's the same kind of group as we talked about before. These are the people that are led by Hamilton, and they believe that the Constitution grants implied powers, that they argue for a loose interpretation of the Constitution, and they believe in an economy based on manufacture and trade. So you need to know those three things. That the Constitution gives implied powers. In other words, you don't have to have things stated directly. The Elastic Clause is in there for a reason. And there's a loose interpretation of the Constitution. You don't have to have it word for word. And the economy should be based on manufacturing and trade. And I think I've stated that even before now, that was Hamilton's idea of how things should be run. Now, the other group is not the Anti-Federalists, all right? So we'll get that out of your head right now. The other group is called the Democratic Republicans. And they are led by Jefferson, and he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And they're also led by Madison, oddly enough. So he's not siding up with the Federalists on this. Madison is siding up with Jefferson, with the Democratic Republicans. Now, this is important, people, because you have two of the most important people in the country, Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and Madison, who wrote the Constitution, who are going to create this whole new political party called the Democratic Republicans, and they are siding against Hamilton and his National Bank and his Federalist Party. These people believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. If it doesn't say bank, then no bank. It doesn't have implied powers, and they believe that farming should be the basis of the economy of the new country. And government powers should be limited to what's absolutely necessary. See the red? I've got red in this PowerPoint several times. Please pay attention to the red. The debate over the bank is what started this problem. So the debate over the bank issue is what started political parties. So the fact that you have Jefferson and Madison coming down on the side of the Democratic Republicans, they're pretty heavyweight when you talk about government in the United States in this new baby country. All right, so what is the role of the people in these two parties? All right, well, the Federalists support a representative government, but think that the educated, wealthier men should be the people who should hold office, not the little folk, not uneducated people, not farmers and shop workers and people like that. So people like Hamilton feel like only people that are highly educated and really probably wealthy should be holding political office because they're the only people who know enough to actually run the country. Now, the Democratic Republicans don't necessarily think that you should just put the government in the hands of uneducated people, but they think a strong central government is only going to be safe if ordinary people can still be a part of it. So even though Jefferson and Madison themselves are both fairly wealthy and highly educated people, They see the point that you have to involve everyone in government in order for this to be a good government of all the people. All right, so we're going to have an election in 1796, right before 1800. And to prepare for this elections, both parties hold caucuses, and you need to become familiar with that term because in last year's election cycle, as this still happens every single time for a presidential election cycle, we talk about caucuses. The Iowa caucuses are the very first meetings, and they still call them caucuses, they'll still call them that in 2020. They are the very first meetings that the states start to hold as far as presidential politics are concerned, when they start to choose who their people are going to be to run for their parties. And so that's an important thing. It's not choosing the president himself, but choosing the person who's going to represent the party. And Iowa always goes first, or at least it always has, unless they change it between now and 2020. All right, so each party chose 2 presidential candidates. Notice we're not choosing a president and a vice president to run together. They chose 2 presidential candidates to run. So the country is going to have 4 people to choose from, 2 Federalists and 2 Democratic Republicans, all right? So here's how it worked back in the day. The president and vice president don't run as a ticket or a team. The person with the most votes becomes president, and the person with the second most votes overall becomes vice president. The Federalists chose John Adams and Charles Pinckney as their 2 people to represent them. Those are going to be their 2 people that they're going to put on their ballot for people to vote for. John Adams, again, strong believer in central government. And he was George Washington's vice president, so that was a good pick for them. Charles Pinckney, I mean, we'll talk about him a little bit later, but not very well known, but he was a good, solid person. As you can see by his military uniform down there, he had served in the Revolution. The Democratic Republicans chose Thomas Jefferson, and again, you don't get much better than that, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and Aaron Burr, who is not that well known yet, but he will become well known. So these are the 4 people that they're putting up as presidential hopefuls back in 1796. Not surprisingly, the Federalists and Adams carry the New England region, and they have the most population. And so he's going to end up winning because just like then, it's electoral votes, people. That's what counts. Adams gets 71 electoral votes. Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans get the agricultural South with 68 electoral college votes. Jefferson wins, but guess what? Adams wins, but guess what? Jefferson comes in second. So now you have Adams as president and Jefferson as vice president. These 2 people think completely differently about how the country should be. Remember how I told you. One thinks we should have our economy based on trade and manufacturing. One thinks our economy should be based on farming. Now, in the real world, the new nation's economy should be based on both. But these 2 people are on opposite ends of the ruler, okay? They're on diametrically opposed to each other in almost every way. They're not enemies. Please don't get me wrong. They're not enemies. But they think completely differently about how the country should be run, and that's going to make it difficult for them. Okay, so John Adams had served 2 terms as Washington's vice president, and so he sort of knows the job, and that's good for him because he's watched Washington. He's been right there with him for most of it. And the people probably had partly elected him as they wanted more Washington. They couldn't have more Washington because Washington said, I'm done. I want to go home now. I think 2 terms is enough for everyone. And so that was the end of Washington. But Adams was not more Washington. I want to take a minute here, and I'm going to stop on this frame and break this screencast into 2 parts, but I want to take a minute here and talk about a couple things right here. First, Washington was setting a precedent, again here, that presidents will only serve 2 terms. This rule was not ever broken until in the 1900s. So no one ever served more than 2 terms, even though they might have been able to, until Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1900s. And then after that, they changed the Constitution so that presidents couldn't serve more than 2 terms. But understand that because Washington said 2 terms is enough, that was the rule from that time going forward. Okay, it wasn't like a constitutional rule, but people thought if that's good enough for Washington, that is simply going to be good enough for me. I will not serve more than 2 terms, okay? So that's one thing I want to talk about right here. The other thing I want to talk about right here is the fact that When people elect someone's vice president because they think they're going to get more of that same president, that hardly ever works. I've lived long enough to see this happen a time or so, and normally the vice president that is elected is a one-term president because the people usually are very much disappointed in the person. The president is usually wildly popular and is very much appreciated by everyone in the country. And then the vice president, who then becomes president after him because that person was popular, is not liked nearly as much because they find out that, oh, this is not more of them. And my most recent example that I can think of in my lifetime is Ronald Reagan. Everyone loved him, Democrats and Republicans alike. He was voted in a landslide twice. And then his vice president, George Bush, the older George Bush, was elected mostly, honestly, because people wanted more Reagan. Well, they didn't get more Reagan, and Bush was a one-hit wonder. So I really, this is kind of a thing that you can kind of look at, and this happened other times in the past that I will point out to you as we go along. But it's kind of a true thing. And so as you grow up and you vote and you watch this happen, maybe sometime in your lifetime, kind of think back to this and see if it kind of holds true in your lifetime. Now I'm going to stop this screencast here and come back to some things that Adams had problems with in his presidency because it wasn't good. He wasn't more Washington.